The veteran thought he had bought nothing but ruins for $1. But the very next morning, his dog led him to a discovery that changed everything. No one was prepared for what the abandoned lighthouse was hiding. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The cheap highway coffee had long since gone cold in its paper cup, but John kept drinking it anyway. The bitter edge of it was all that stood between him and the kind of sleep that never rested, the kind that dragged him back into deserts and ruins and the echoes of artillery fire. He sat hunched over the steering wheel of his battered pickup, his dog curled beside him on the passenger seat, as the last leg of the journey carried him farther from the places where people still remembered his name. The military had left him with scars and a pension barely enough to scrape by, but it was the silence afterward that had broken him. Nights spent staring at walls, days filled with temporary jobs that ended as soon as someone noticed his hands shook when doors slammed. He had nothing left in Reno, nothing left anywhere, except for the dog who refused to leave his side. The animal was a sturdy shepherd mix with ears that twitched at every sound. Eyes always locked on John as though waiting for orders. They had been together since Afghanistan, when the dog had alerted the unit to movement in the dark, saving more than one life. Soldiers had rotated home, some in body bags, some to lives they couldn't fit back into, but the dog had remained. John sometimes thought the dog was the last tether holding him to this world. He had named him Ranger, though he rarely used it. Usually it was just boy, or nothing at all, just a quiet hand on the scruff of his neck when the memories threatened to crush him. He had not planned on buying anything, least of all property. The idea of owning a home seemed laughable when his bank account barely stretched to the end of each month. But the ad had been impossible to ignore. A short column in the back of a local newspaper, one of those small-town weeklies with classifieds about yard sales and old tractors. For sale, decommissioned Lighthouse, Windmere Cove, $1. Buyer assumes all responsibility. At first he had thought it was a joke, some real estate stunt meant to draw attention. But when he called the number, a weary-sounding clerk confirmed it. The place had been abandoned for decades, tied up in probate and county taxes until nobody wanted it anymore. The government had written it off, and the locals had given up. $1. That was less than the coffee in his hand, less than the cheap cigarettes he sometimes bought when the nights grew too long. He knew it was absurd. What did he know about lighthouses? About repairing stone walls and rusted beams? But something in the ad had gnawed at him, a whisper in the back of his mind that maybe this was what he had been waiting for. A place no one wanted, a place as broken as he felt, standing at the edge of the world where the sea erased all noise. He had sold the last of his furniture, closed the door on the apartment that had never felt like home, and put Ranger in the truck. With the crumpled deed in his glove box, he had started driving north until the desert gave way, to forests and the forests to gray water and cliffs. The drive had taken 3 days, each mile pulling him deeper into silence. The smooth hum of interstate turned into narrow state roads, then to cracked blacktop that twisted along jagged cliffs. The ocean appeared suddenly, a stretch of slate blue beneath clouds that pressed low against the horizon. Ranger stirred then, sitting up, his mismatched eyes fixed on the view as if he understood this was the end of the road. John said nothing. Words felt too heavy in his mouth, and besides, he was not a man of speeches anymore. He gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened and told himself this was just another mission, another assignment. Only this time there was no commanding officer, no brothers at his back, just him and the dog. By the time he rolled into Windmere Cove, the town was already shrinking into dusk. It was the kind of place built on a promise that had never come true, its main street lined with peeling paint and hand-painted signs. Lobster boats rocked lazily in the harbor, their ropes creaking in the salt wind. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, the only splash of color in the otherwise gray street. People turned as his truck passed, not hostile, not welcoming, simply curious in that way of towns that see very few strangers. He pulled up outside the county office, where a thin man in a worn tie handed him the keys with all the ceremony of someone discarding a burden. "She's all yours," the man said. "Been empty a long while. Ain't for everyone." John closed his hand around the brass key. It was heavier than it looked. cold as if it had never been warmed by another palm. "I'm not everyone," he answered, his voice low but steady. The clerk only shrugged, already reaching for his coffee. Leaving town behind, John drove the last stretch in near darkness. The road narrowed, then crumbled into gravel that rattled under his tires. Trees fell away, replaced by bare cliffs where the wind came sharp and unrelenting. And then it was there. The lighthouse rose like a sentinel against the dying light, its tower scarred by salt and storms, its lantern room black and empty. The keeper's cottage sagged at its base, roof sloping, windows blind. It was not the romantic picture from postcards, not a place for weddings or painters. It was a ruin. Yet as John stepped out of the truck, the sea air hitting him like a slap, he felt something shift in his chest. Ranger jumped down beside him, nose lifted, tail stiff. Together they stood at the edge of the world, looking up at the stone tower that seemed to breathe with the wind. "This is it," John murmured. His voice was nearly swallowed by the surf below. Ranger pressed against his leg, a silent reassurance. The ground was nothing but stubborn grass and scattered shells, sloping to the black rocks where waves shattered in white spray. The air smelled of salt and rust, sharp enough to sting his lungs. John reached out and ran a hand over the stone, rough and cold beneath his palm. Rust streaks bled down where iron rails had once held fast. Moss clung at the base like old sorrow. He had seen buildings like this in other countries, ruins where people once fought to hold a line that no longer mattered. This at least was his. He unpacked with the precision of a man who had moved too many times. A roll-up mattress, a camp stove, a cooler with food, a lantern. He spread them in the corner of the keeper's cottage, sweeping aside dust thick as ash. The air inside smelled of mildew and memories too long shut away. Ranger circled once, then lay with his back to the wall, eyes fixed on the door. John ate a sandwich cross-legged on the floor, the lantern casting a weak golden glow against peeling wallpaper. Outside, the wind keened like voices caught between cliff and sea. Inside, silence pressed close, heavy but not suffocating. For the first time in years, he did not feel caged. That night, he lay under a scratchy blanket, staring at the ceiling beams as the storm hummed against the walls. Sleep came in fragments, broken by Ranger's restless pacing. More than once, John woke to the sound of claws clicking against the boards, the dog sniffing at corners, growling low at the window. At one point, Ranger froze, ears forward, gaze locked on the farthest shadow where the lamplight did not reach. John stirred, half whispering, "Easy, boy." The dog looked back, whined once, then resumed his patrol. John exhaled and rolled onto his side. He told himself the house was old, full of noises that meant nothing. But in his gut, he knew Ranger did not chase ghosts. The dog had survived too much to waste energy on shadows. Morning came reluctantly, sky bruised in shades of lavender and rust. John rose stiffly, his sleep fractured, his body sore from the hard floor. But as sunlight touched the stones outside, something inside him shifted too. Work had always been his salvation. In war zones, building comms towers or digging trenches had steadied his hands, given purpose when chaos threatened to consume him. Here too he found the rhythm. He began by clearing debris, sweeping broken glass from windows, scrubbing mold with harsh soap until his arms burned. Ranger followed him everywhere, no longer agitated but watchful, as though satisfied his partner had found a mission worth guarding. By noon, the cottage looked less like a tomb and more like the beginning of a home. John stood in the doorway, sweat soaking the bandana around his head, his shirt clinging to his back. The lighthouse loomed beside him, its door half open, the spiral staircase within visible in the dim light. He felt it calling, silent yet insistent. He picked up his toolbox, the weight familiar, and stepped inside. The air was cooler, heavy with dust and salt. His footsteps echoed against the stone, each rise of the stair bringing him higher into a silence that felt older than him, older than the town, older than the sea itself. Narrow windows slit the walls, light cutting through in golden spears. Coils of rope lay forgotten, rusted tools scattered like relics. When at last he pushed open the iron door, the lantern room spread out around him, glass and metal suspended in sky. He stepped forward, breath-catching. The view stretched endless in every direction, the restless ocean below, cliffs scarred and defiant behind, the town reduced to a watercolor blur in the distance. At the center stood the great lens, dulled and salt-crusted, yet whole, a monument to endurance, waiting for someone to remember it. John rested his hand on the rail, his heart loud in the silence. Ranger padded once around the room, then stopped, nose pressed to the floor. A low whine escaped him as he pawed insistently at a spot near the base of the lens. John frowned. "Not now," he muttered, but the dog persisted. Finally, John knelt, pressing his palm against the worn board. It felt solid, but Ranger's stare did not waver. John fetched his multi-tool, slid the blade beneath the wood, and pried gently. The board groaned, shifted, then gave way, revealing a hollow space carved into the subfloor. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. John lifted it. Heavy and deliberate, not debris but something hidden. With careful hands he unwrapped the layers. A leather-bound journal emerged, its cover smoothed by time, embossed faintly with a compass rose. No name, no title. Beneath it rested a compass of heavy brass, ornate engravings catching the weak light. He turned it in his palm, glass thick, needles spinning lazily, before locking not north, but seaward, unmoving, unwavering. Ranger tilted his head, ears twitching. John sat back, journal in his lap, compass in hand, the sound of waves pounding far below. He told himself it was nonsense, the ravings of some long-gone keeper. But the patterns on the page, the cryptic sketches and maps, stirred recognition in him. Codes, symbols, strategies. Not madness method. He sat there for a long while, feeling the weight of it all. He had come to the end of the world to disappear, to drown the noise inside his head. Instead, he had uncovered a voice older than his own, whispering through salt and paper. He closed the journal, slid the compass into his pocket, and rose. Whatever this was, he knew one thing. It was not the end. It was the beginning. The journal and compass remained on the table that night, silent companions in the dim glow of the lantern. John did not open the pages again after his first hurried glance, but the images clung to him with the stubbornness of old scars. Sketches of stars drawn like tangled spider webs, words scratched in ink that had bled and faded with time, a compass that refused to obey the earth. He had thought he was coming here for an ending, a final retreat from the noise of the world, but the weight of those objects suggested a beginning. Ranger lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, though his mismatched eyes flicked often to the window, as if watching for something his master could not see. Outside, the wind rattled against the walls, carrying the roar of waves that never slept. John's mind circled in restless loops until the lantern finally burned low. By dawn, a dull silver light bled across the horizon, tugging him to his feet. The air inside the cottage was sharp with the scent of mildew, yet he breathed it in deeply, letting it fill him like something earned. He rose stiffly from the mattress, his body aching from labor, but his hands itched for more. The sea outside was restless, slate-colored and rising, and the tower loomed with the stubborn patience of stone that had endured far longer than him. He stepped outside, pulling his jacket close, and looked down at Ranger, who was already scanning the cliffs with sharp ears raised. Together they turned their eyes toward the lighthouse. It stood as if carved out of the sky itself, rising from the black rock of the cliff like the last survivor of a forgotten war. The stonework bore scars from storms, rust streaked down where iron rails had once clung, and the lantern room above sat blind and hollow. Yet the tower was not defeated. It defied the wind, the salt, the years of abandonment. John knew the feeling well. He reached into his pocket and closed his fingers around the compass. The needle pulled steady, not north but seaward, as if demanding that he look beyond what his eyes could see. He returned it to his coat, squared his shoulders, and started toward the base of the tower. The door resisted at first, swollen by time and salt, but his weight against it sent a groan of wood and metal echoing into the stairwell. The air inside was cooler, damper, infused with the scent of stone that had stood against 1,000 storms. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light that cut through narrow slits of windows. Each step of the spiral staircase rang out in hollow rhythm, his boots leaving faint marks on boards layered with grit. Ranger followed close behind, his nails clicking softly, his ears rotating to track sounds that John could not hear. They ascended slowly, floor after floor, where rusted tools lay abandoned and ropes decayed into coils of brittle fiber. Every chamber was a frozen memory, like someone had walked away mid-task and never returned. At the top, the lantern room opened around them, a crown of iron and glass perched against the infinite horizon. John stepped through the doorway, his breath catching. The sea spread endless beneath him. Cliffs tore upward behind, and the town of Windmere Cove lay distant and small, like a watercolor painted in shades of blue and gray. The lens at the room's center was enormous, its glass dulled with salt, yet whole. It had once caught light and flung it across miles of ocean, guiding sailors through darkness and storm. Now it stood mute, waiting for a keeper who would never return. John placed a hand on the railing, and for the first time in years felt something stir in him that was not grief or weariness. Purpose. Ranger's presence drew him back. The dog circled once, then lowered his nose to the floor, sniffing at a seam between planks. A low whine escaped him, and he pawed once, then again, with insistence. John knelt, frowning. He had already found one secret in the cottage. Could there be another here, at the heart of the tower? He pressed his hand to the wood. It felt solid, cold, ordinary. But Ranger did not relent, his mismatched eyes fixed on the spot with a soldier's patience. With a sigh, John reached for his tool, slid the flat edge beneath the seam, and pried. The wood groaned, cracked, and finally lifted. Beneath lay a shallow cavity, barely large enough for a book. His fingers closed around the bundle inside, wrapped in oiled canvas heavy with age. He lifted it carefully as though it might dissolve in his grasp. He unwrapped the layers and found the journal again, this time with more light to study it. The compass followed, ornate engravings glinting faintly as the sea breeze whispered through broken panes. He traced the faded gold of the compass rose stamped on the cover of the book. His mind tugged at fragments of old training satellite charts, coded transmissions, messages disguised as ordinary text. He had spent years spotting anomalies where others saw only chaos. These pages felt the same. A puzzle, deliberate, structured. He turned a page and read a single line written with stark precision. The sea never gives up her dead, but sometimes she whispers their stories to those who listen. The words lodged in him like a hook. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes roaming from the pages to the horizon. Ranger settled at his side, his body pressed close, silent and steady. John knew then that he was not simply the new owner of a forgotten ruin. He was stepping into a story that had begun long before him and had waited through storms and silence to be found. For a man who had thought his story already over, the realization was disquieting, almost unbearable. Yet beneath the unease, something else flickered. Hope, faint but undeniable, like the first spark struck against steel. Later, when the sun began to slide low, John descended the tower with the journal tucked under his arm and the compass heavy in his coat. The air outside was colder, the wind sharper, but he felt steadier than he had in years. He crossed the path back to the cottage, boots crunching over gravel, his shadow long and stretched across the grass. The ocean roared below with the same endless rhythm. But it no longer sounded hostile. It sounded alive, full of voices just beyond hearing. Ranger trotted ahead, ears pricked, then stopped at the edge of the cliff. He barked once, sharp and urgent, staring across the cove. John followed his gaze and caught it, just a glimmer, a flash of reflected light from the ridge opposite, gone as quickly as it appeared. Binoculars. Someone was watching. His stomach tightened, a cold weight settling in his chest. He closed his hand around the compass in his pocket, feeling its steady pull. Someone knew, or maybe someone had always been waiting. The cottage behind him creaked as if in agreement, the boards complaining against the wind. He turned and walked back, pulling Ranger with him. The day was ending, but something else had only just begun. Inside, he placed the journal on the table once more. He did not open it this time. Instead, he sat in silence, staring at the flicker of the lantern while Ranger kept vigil at the door. He was not a man prone to superstition. He had lived through too much to believe in omens or curses. Yet the longer he sat, the more certain he became that the lighthouse had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for him. And in that certainty, for the first time since leaving the service, he felt less like a man running from ghosts and more like one who might finally have something worth defending. The night deepened and Windmere Cove slept, but on the ridge above, a dark vehicle remained parked, its windows glinting faintly in the moonlight. Inside, unseen eyes tracked the faint glow of the lantern in the cottage below. The watcher did not move, did not approach. He only waited, patient as the tide. And down in the keeper's house, John Whitaker closed his eyes, one hand resting on the leather journal, the other on the thick fur of his dog. Sleep came uneasily, but it came, and for once his dreams were not of war. They were of waves, of light, and of a tower that still stood against the sky. Morning returned with the gray wash of a sky that seemed to stretch endlessly over the Pacific, the sound of the sea filling every corner of the ruined cottage. John woke stiff and restless, the cold floor pressing into his back through the thin mattress. Ranger was already awake, ears pricked, watching the door as if expecting something to arrive uninvited. For a long moment John lay still, listening to the rhythm of waves against rock, the whine of wind around the tower, the faint crack and pop of the timbers settling. He remembered the glimmer on the ridge the evening before, the certainty of eyes upon him, and for a moment his chest tightened. But then his gaze fell on the leather-bound journal resting on the table where he had left it. Its faded compass rose just visible in the early light, and a steadiness returned to him. He was here now, and this place was his. Whether someone watched or not, he would not abandon it. He rose slowly, pulling on his boots, and stepped outside. The grass around the cottage was damp with morning mist, beads of water clinging to every blade and glinting faintly when the sun began to push through the horizon. The lighthouse loomed as always, a pillar of stone against the pale sky, but somehow it no longer looked like an abandoned relic. It looked like a challenge. The walls were scarred, the railings rusted, but it had survived storms that would have flattened other buildings. It stood because it had to. And perhaps, he thought, so did he. Ranger padded beside him as he began the day's work. John gathered the tools he had brought from the truck and walked the perimeter of the cottage, inspecting broken shutters, sagging beams, and shattered panes. The work was overwhelming at first glance, but he welcomed the enormity of it. Better to drown in labor than in silence. He started with the door, tightening hinges, hammering rusted nails into place until the wood felt steady beneath his hands. From there he moved to the windows, pulling out shards of glass and boarding them temporarily with planks scavenged from a half-collapsed shed nearby. His movements were methodical, almost ritual, each strike of the hammer pulling him further from the weight of memory and closer to the rhythm of the present. Inside, dust rose in clouds with every sweep of the broom, drifting in shafts of light that pierced the cracks in the walls. The smell of mildew was sharp, but beneath it was the scent of salt, of stone, of the sea. He wiped the counters clean, dragged broken chairs into a pile outside, and patched the holes in the roof with tarps until he could find better material. By midday, sweat clung to his skin, the muscles in his arms and back ached, but when he stepped into the doorway to rest, the cottage looked less like a ruin and more like something alive again. Ranger watched from the yard, his tongue lolling as he lay in a patch of sunlight. But his eyes were alert, scanning the cliffs as if he too understood they were settling into contested ground. When John finally stopped to eat, he sat cross-legged on the floor again, a tin plate balanced on his knees. Peanut butter and crackers, little more than rations, but he ate with a hunger sharpened by work. Ranger sat close, head resting against John's thigh, silent in the way only a dog could be, offering presence rather than words. John's gaze drifted to the journal on the table. He had resisted reopening it during the morning, afraid of what he might find if he looked too closely, but now the pull was too strong. He set aside the plate, wiped his hands on his jeans, and pulled the book into his lap. The pages crackled as he opened them. The ink faded but still legible, though the handwriting was dense and slanted. At first the entries seemed like ordinary records. Tides, storms, repairs to the lantern room, sightings of ships. But as he read deeper, the words shifted. The keeper had written of long nights, of silence that pressed like a weight, of the way the wind seemed to carry voices when it howled around the tower. He wrote of his wife and son, both lost to illness long before, and of the loneliness that grew heavier with each passing year. John's eyes lingered on sentences that could have been his own thoughts. The nights are the hardest. The sea does not sleep, but it does not speak either, and so I hear only myself. Another line struck him harder. Light is all that is left to me, and so I must keep it burning, no matter what else is taken. John closed the book for a moment, staring into the flickering lantern light as if the words were carved across the air itself. He had thought his burdens were his alone, born of deserts and gunfire. But here was a man a century dead who had written the same despair in ink that still endured. The realization was sobering, almost unbearable, and yet it was also a strange kind of comfort. He was not unique in his struggle. Others had stood where he stood, fought against silence, and endured. That night, after another long day of hammering, scrubbing, and hauling debris, he lay again on his mattress with Ranger curled against the wall nearby. But sleep did not come easily. The wind moaned across the cliffs, boards creaked overhead, and every sound seemed sharper in the dark. Ranger shifted often, rising to pace, sniffing the corners, growling low at the door. At one point the dog froze, head turned toward the window, ears stiff. John pushed himself up, heart thudding, and peered through the cracked glass. Nothing but darkness and the silver line of moonlight on the waves. Still, he could not shake the memory of the glimmer on the ridge. He whispered to Ranger, trying to soothe them both, but neither of them truly relaxed until the first hints of dawn softened the horizon. The following morning, John decided to investigate further. As he moved through the cottage, sweeping dust into piles and stacking broken furniture outside, he noticed a section of floor near the hearth that sounded hollow when he stepped across it. Frowning, he knelt and ran his hand across the boards. One plank shifted slightly under his weight, edges raised just enough to betray its secret. He fetched his multi-tool again, worked the flat blade beneath, and levered it upward with a grunt. The board came loose, groaning as though resenting the disturbance, and beneath it yawned a shallow cavity. His breath caught. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, was a small chest, no larger than a shoebox. He lifted it carefully, dust and splinters falling away, and set it on the table. Ranger stood close, tail stiff, eyes fixed as if sensing the importance of the discovery. John hesitated, then unwrapped the cloth. The chest was iron-bound, rusted but intact. The clasp yielded reluctantly to pressure, snapping with a sharp sound that echoed too loudly in the silent room. Inside lay a collection of letters, tied with ribbon, frayed to near nothing, and beneath them a sheaf of papers, folded neatly despite their age. He lifted the top letter, its ink blurred but legible, and read the salutation. "My dearest Eleanor." The words that followed were heavy with grief, written by a man who had lost his family and was writing to the memory of a wife long dead. Yet amid the sorrow were details of storms survived, of nights when ships nearly wrecked but were saved by the lighthouse's glow. There were sketches of the coast, detailed notations of currents and tides, and once more, cryptic lines that hinted at something hidden, something guarded. "They came again tonight," one line read, "demanding what I cannot give. I told them the light is not for sale. I told them it must remain, no matter the cost." John frowned, reading the line again, the hair rising on his arms. What could anyone have demanded of a keeper alone on a cliff? He closed the chest, pressing his palms against the lid, and sat back heavily in the chair. Ranger rested his chin on John's knee, eyes searching his face as if to ask what he had found. John stroked the dog's head absently, his mind circling around the words. He had come here to disappear, to escape the weight of his own history. But it seemed the lighthouse had other plans. Its walls held secrets. Its floorboards whispered of men who had stood against forces unseen. and now he had joined them, whether he wanted to or not. By the third day, the cottage began to feel less like a ruin and more like a place where a man could live. The roof still leaked in places, but tarps held most of the rain. The windows were sealed, the doors firm, the dust swept away. In the evenings, John sat with the journal in his lap, the letters from the chest spread across the table, and Ranger asleep at his feet. The entries did not tell a simple story. They hinted, suggested, circled truths without ever naming them. But through it all ran the same threads: duty, loss, secrets carried alone. And as John read, he realized that in restoring this place, he was not only repairing walls and doors. He was repairing something in himself. The nights remained uneasy. Ranger often growled at the darkness, ears pricked toward the cliffs. Once John thought he heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside, though when he stepped out with a lantern, the yard lay empty, only the wind stirring the grass. Yet each morning he returned to work, undeterred, driven by something he could not fully name. Each nail driven into wood, each board set back into place, felt like a defiance of everything that had tried to break him. And with each passing day, the lighthouse loomed less as a ruin and more as a promise. By the end of that first week, John knew two things with certainty. The lighthouse was not just a place to hide. It was a place to stand, to fight, to endure, and whatever secrets it still held, buried in journals, whispered in letters, hinted at by the strange compass that pointed only to sea, they were now his to uncover. Ranger seemed to sense the shift as well. The dog no longer paced at night with the same unease, but lay close, watchful yet calm, as if he too had accepted that this was home. As the sun sank behind the hills one evening, casting the sky in golden blood, John stood at the doorway of the cottage and looked out at the tower. Its windows glowed faintly in the fading light, not from any lamp, but from the reflection of the dying day. He tightened his grip on the journal tucked beneath his arm, the compass resting heavy in his pocket, and whispered to the empty air, "This is just the beginning." And though the wind carried his words away, the stones of the lighthouse seemed to hear, seemed to answer with silence as steady as the tide. The days bled into one another with the rhythm of hammer strikes and the scrape of tools against stone. John welcomed the exhaustion that came with rebuilding, because it dulled the restless edge of his mind and gave him something to measure his progress against. Each morning he rose with the sea's roar in his ears. Each night he fell onto the mattress with Ranger curled close, and though the cottage still smelled of damp and the wind still rattled the windows, the place began to feel less like a ruin and more like a shelter. Yet no matter how much labor he poured into wood and stone, the weight of the journal and the letters in the iron-bound chest pressed heavier on him. They were constant reminders that the walls around him were not silent. They carried the voices of those who had stood here before, voices that seemed to whisper in every draft and echo in the stairwell of the tower. It was on one such evening, when the last light of the sun had turned the horizon to golden fire, that John opened the journal again with deliberate intent. He sat at the table, the lantern burning low beside him, Ranger stretched out on the floor, but with his mismatched eyes fixed on his master, as if he too understood the importance of the act. John turned the pages slowly, careful with the fragile paper. At first there were the usual notes: ships sighted at dawn, the oil in the lantern running low, storms that battered the cliffs. But deeper into the book, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew sharper, more urgent, the words edged with desperation. "The nights lengthen," one entry read, "and with them the silence grows. It presses on my chest heavier than the sea. I speak aloud sometimes, though there is no one left to hear me. I fear the sound of my own voice more than the wind." John traced the faded letters with his finger, his throat tightening. He knew that silence, the kind that swallowed whole battalions, the kind that haunted him long after the explosions had ceased. Another passage caught his eye. "They say the sea does not give back what it takes, but I hear it at night. The voices of men lost in storms, their words carried on the spray. Perhaps I am mad. Perhaps the sea has chosen me as its confessor." John leaned back, the words striking too close to home. He remembered nights in foreign deserts, hearing the cries of men in his dreams, waking to realize they had been real and then gone, taken too swiftly for him to save. The keeper's words could have been his own, written across the decades by a hand that understood the same torment. In the letters, too, the echo was undeniable. One written to a wife long dead spoke of storms endured alone, of a child's laughter remembered only in the crash of waves. Another warned of visitors who came not with gratitude but with demands. They pressed me again for what I cannot give. I told them the light belongs to the sea, not to men. They left angry. I fear they will return. John read that line over and over, the unease in his chest growing sharper. Who were these men, and what had they wanted from a solitary keeper? The cottage creaked around him as though in answer. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked. Gaze fixed on the window. A low growl rumbled in his throat. John set the letter down and rose, crossing the room to peer through the glass. Beyond the warped panes, the yard was silvered by moonlight, the grass bending under the restless wind. Nothing moved, yet the hair along his arm stood on end. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, scanning the yard, the path to the cliffs, the shadowed base of the tower. Only the roar of the ocean answered him, but Ranger did not relax until long after they returned inside. Sleep was elusive that night. John lay awake listening to Ranger pace the floorboards, claws clicking softly as the dog moved from door to window, ever vigilant. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe evenly, but the keeper's words echoed in his skull. They pressed me again. They will return. And though he told himself it was only the paranoia of a lonely man from another century, he could not shake the feeling that he was being drawn into a story that had not yet ended. The following day he returned to the tower. The spiral staircase groaned under his weight as he climbed, dust falling in faint motes around him. At the top, the lantern room opened to the vast expanse of sea and sky, and the great lens stood silent at its center. He circled it slowly, running his hand along the iron rail, until he came to the spot Ranger had pawed at days before. He knelt and placed his palm against the boards. For a moment he thought he heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration, like a heartbeat buried deep in the stone. He shook his head, telling himself it was only the wind rattling the frame, yet the sensation lingered long after he descended the stairs again. That evening, as he walked into town for supplies, the whispers began. He felt them before he heard them. The way conversations hushed when he entered the general store, the sideways glances that followed him as he paid in cash for nails, oil, and food. A man by the counter muttered to another, "The fool bought the cursed light." A woman near the shelves clutched her child's hand tighter when he passed. No one said anything to his face, but the message was clear. He was an intruder, an outsider who had taken something that the town had abandoned but not forgotten. At the diner, he took a seat in the far booth out of habit, his back to the wall, Ranger lying quietly beneath the table. The waitress, a woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes sharp as glass, poured him coffee without asking. After a long pause, she said, "You're the one living up there now." John nodded, waiting. She studied him a moment longer, then added, "Used to know the man who kept that place. Arthur Blackwood. Nobody said that name in years." John's chest tightened. Arthur, the name from the letters, the voice in the journal. He leaned forward, his voice low. He left something behind, something he wanted protected. The woman's gaze flicked to the window, then back to him. Everyone thought Arthur was mad. Talking about ships and secrets, said the sea whispered to him. But I knew him. He wasn't mad. He was scared. Whatever he was keeping, it cost him his life. She straightened, poured more coffee, and walked away without another word. John sat still for a long time, the journal's weight suddenly heavier in his bag. When he returned to the lighthouse that evening, the sun was sinking fast, bleeding orange and crimson across the horizon. Ranger leapt from the truck before John had cut the engine, sprinting across the yard to the cliff's edge. His bark was sharp, furious. John followed, his eyes narrowing as he looked across the cove. For just a heartbeat, he saw it again, the glint of reflected glass, a flash of light vanishing behind the ridge. Binoculars. Someone was watching. He felt the cold press of inevitability settle in his stomach. Back inside, he bolted the door and pulled the curtains tight. Ranger paced, restless, pausing often to stare at the window as though expecting it to shatter. John placed the journal on the table, his hands steady though his pulse hammered. He flipped through the pages again, this time not searching for comfort but for strategy. The entries whispered of secrets, of men who demanded what they could not have, of a keeper who had died for his silence. And now John understood with a clarity that cut deep. It was not just a mystery hidden in these walls. It was bait, and someone, somewhere beyond the ridge, had already taken the hook. Sleep did not come easily that night. He sat long into the dark with the lantern burning low, tracing the lines of Arthur's maps, trying to decipher the codes in the constellations, the strange diagrams that made no sense to untrained eyes. He remembered the training that had once defined his life, the endless drills of pattern recognition, of spotting anomalies in the chaos. And slowly, between the inked lines and the empty spaces, a pattern began to emerge. Arthur's maps were not of the skies above, but of the waters below. The stars were reefs, the comets were currents, and at the heart of the spiral that repeated throughout the pages lay the same name, Caledonia. John leaned back, his breath unsteady as the realization sank in. The ship had not been lost to myth. It had been buried beneath tides and silence, hidden within sight of the lighthouse. Arthur had dedicated his life to guarding it, and had paid with that life in the end. Now the responsibility had passed to John, whether he wanted it or not. Ranger shifted at his feet, pressing his weight against John's boot, as though to remind him he was not alone. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, John still sat at the table, the journal open before him, the compass heavy in his pocket. He had thought he came here to disappear, to bury himself in stone and sea until the world forgot him. Instead, he had stumbled into a fight older than himself, one that had claimed at least one life already. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting on Ranger's head. "Looks like we're in it now, boy," he whispered. The dog did not blink, did not move, only leaned into his touch with quiet certainty. For the first time in years, John felt purpose settle into him, like a weight he could carry. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. Whoever watched from the ridge would not remain patient forever. But as he looked at the tower rising against the morning sky, scarred and defiant, he knew he would not leave. The lighthouse had chosen him, and he would keep its light no matter the cost. The following days thickened with a sense of unease that no amount of work could fully shake loose. John moved through them with the same methodical determination that had carried him through the worst places on earth, hammering nails, repairing shutters, clearing the grounds around the cottage and the base of the tower. His hands grew raw, his muscles ached, but the structure slowly regained a measure of dignity, as though it too was grateful to be useful again. Yet even as the walls firmed and the glass was scrubbed clean of decades of salt, he felt the invisible pressure of eyes watching from somewhere he could not see. Ranger knew it too. The dog's movements had changed, no longer pacing aimlessly as on those first nights, but pausing often to sniff the air, his mismatched gaze turning sharp whenever the wind shifted across the ridge. When John finally ventured back into town, the shift was immediate. The streets of Windmere Cove were quiet that morning, the boats rocking lazily in the harbor as gulls circled overhead. The first faces he passed turned away too quickly, and conversations seemed to falter when he entered the small general store. He picked up the supplies he needed: canned food, lamp oil, more nails, and carried them to the counter without comment. But he could feel the weight of their stares. An old fisherman with weathered hands muttered under his breath to another man by the doorway, but the words were clear enough to reach him. "Should have left the light alone. Fool doesn't know what he's invited in." John kept his expression unreadable, counted out the cash, and walked back to his truck. Ranger waited with his nose pressed to the glass, tail still intense. At the diner, the air was thicker still. The same gray-haired woman with the sharp eyes poured his coffee, but her glance lingered longer this time. The few locals who occupied the booths fell silent when he sat down, their forks pausing midair. John was used to suspicion. He had felt it from civilians back home when he first returned from deployment, seen the wary glances in their eyes, the half-step back when they realized who he was and where he had been. But this was different. This wasn't fear of him. It was fear of the place he now occupied, as though by claiming the lighthouse he had inherited a curse. The woman approached again, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You stirred something that should have stayed buried." John met her gaze evenly. "I only meant to fix what's mine." She shook her head slowly. "That light was never just yours. It belonged to Arthur. And before him, to others who knew better than to let its secrets leave those walls." With that, she straightened and returned to the counter, leaving him with words that tasted of both warning and prophecy. On his way back to the truck, he found the first tangible sign of hostility. Scratched into the layer of dust on his door was a single word: leave. His jaw tightened as he brushed it away with the flat of his hand. Ranger leapt down to greet him, hackles rising as though he too understood the message. John loaded the supplies and drove back toward the cliffs without looking back, though he could feel the eyes of the town following him until the road curved away. The unease only deepened when he reached the cottage. The lock on the door, which he had fixed just days before, hung broken. The wood splintered around it. He pushed inside quickly, Ranger rushing ahead, nose low to the ground. The interior seemed untouched. His tools still lay on the table. The journal and compass still rested where he had left them. But the air carried a disturbance, as though someone had been there. Someone who knew what they were looking for, but hadn't dared to take it. He checked the floorboards where the chest had been hidden, reassuring himself that the letters were still safe. They were. Whoever had come had been careful, perhaps cautious, but the intrusion left its mark more deeply than any theft could have. That night he sat with the journal open before him, though his eyes barely tracked the words. His thoughts spun in widening circles. He remembered the woman's warning in the diner, the fisherman's mutter in the store, the glimmer of binoculars on the ridge. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Arthur's death had not been an accident. The keeper had been guarding something far more significant than his own sanity, and now that burden had passed to John. He had never asked for it, but walking away was no longer an option. The tension between him and the town grew sharper in the days that followed. A group of young men loitered near his truck when he came into town again, one spitting deliberately on the ground as John passed. Another said loudly enough for him to hear, "Place should have fallen into the sea, not into his hands." John ignored them, carried his purchases with steady steps. But inside a cold anger burned. He was no stranger to hostility, but there was something more dangerous in this brand of quiet contempt. These people did not just dislike him, they feared what he represented. Back at the lighthouse, he spent his evenings studying Arthur's writings with renewed intensity. Ranger lay close at his feet, occasionally raising his head when John muttered aloud, trying to piece together meaning from the codes scrawled across the margins. One night, as the waves pounded relentlessly against the cliffs, he came across an entry that froze him. "The men returned. They demanded the location again. I refused. The light is not theirs. It never will be. If they come for me, I pray the sea will keep its silence." John closed the book slowly, his pulse a steady hammer in his ears. It was no longer speculation. Someone had wanted what Arthur had, and someone might still. The following evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the last light bled from the sky, Ranger erupted into sharp barking. John strode to the door, rifle in hand, and flung it open. Across the cove, on the ridge, a shape moved briefly before vanishing into the trees. A flash of glass caught the last of the light binoculars again. He cursed under his breath and lowered the rifle. Whoever they were patient, watchful, and disciplined. He recognized the tactics of men who knew how to stalk and wait. This was no curious local. This was something else. That night he sat in the lantern room at the top of the tower, the journal spread across the floor, diagrams and maps fanned around him. Ranger lay at the window slit, eyes scanning the horizon, ears twitching at every shift in the wind. John forced himself to focus, to see what Arthur had seen. He traced the strange spiral drawn across multiple pages, compared it to tide tables and constellations, and slowly the truth began to surface. the maps were not random. They were layered codes, star charts disguised as nautical routes, and in the center of them all, repeated again and again, was a name: Caledonia. He leaned back, staring at the compass in his palm. The needle quivered once, then steadied, pointing straight out to sea. Not north, never north, always seaward, toward the place Arthur had marked with such desperate precision. John's breath caught as the pieces aligned. The shipwreck had not been lost to myth. It lay hidden beneath the tides, guarded by secrecy and silence, perhaps containing something worth killing for. The walls of the tower seemed to press closer, the sound of the waves below swelling like a heartbeat. He thought of the locals who whispered of curses, of the words scratched into his truck, of the lock broken in his absence. He was no longer a man who had come to disappear. He was the keeper of something that others wanted silenced. The knowledge burned through him, fierce and steady. He had survived worse than this. He had fought through fire and loss. And if the past had chosen him now, then he would stand his ground. Ranger shifted, rising to his feet, ears sharp against the wind. John rested a hand on the dog's flank, steadying them both, and whispered into the darkness, "Let them come." The sea roared in answer, the lighthouse looming around him like a sentinel that had waited too long for someone willing to keep its light alive. The days after the broken lock and the word carved into his truck carried a heavy tension, like the charged silence before an explosion. John moved through them with measured focus, tightening every hinge, repairing every weak spot in the cottage, and preparing as though the storm he feared was not of weather, but of men. Yet the sea had its own plans, and soon the air began to thicken with the kind of weight he remembered from deserts before sandstorms or mountain passes before avalanches. The gulls screamed more sharply overhead, wheeling inland rather than out to sea, and the wind shifted, bringing with it a taste of salt and iron that stung the back of his throat. Ranger sensed it too. The dog paced more often, pausing at the cliff's edge, nose lifted, ears twitching. He growled at nothing John could see, then returned to his master's side with the silent insistence of a soldier warning his commander. By late afternoon, the horizon had grown bruised with thunderclouds. The sky was a ceiling of lead, the sea below turning restless and black, swelling with a power that made the rocks tremble underfoot. John had seen storms overseas that came fast and furious, but this one carried a slower menace, a certainty that it would not pass gently. He tied down everything he could around the yard, hauled firewood and supplies into the cottage, and checked the shutters twice over. In the lantern room at the top of the tower, he reinforced the rusting hinges of the windows with rope and wedges of wood. The air there was already alive with the hum of coming violence, every gust of wind rattling the glass with sharp protest. When the first drops of rain struck, they came sideways, hurled by a wind that shrieked across the cliffs. The sky tore open soon after, lightning slicing jagged patterns above the ocean, thunder rolling so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. John braced himself in the cottage doorway for one last look at the sea before retreating inside. It was not the rolling surface he had seen each morning and evening since he arrived. It was a living beast, coiling and striking at the rocks with waves taller than the lighthouse itself. Ranger pressed against his leg, whining low, but his eyes never left the horizon. John crouched and laid a steadying hand on his fur. "We've stood through worse, boy," he murmured, though his own chest thrummed with unease. Inside, the storm pounded at the walls with relentless fists. Rain lashed against the roof, seeping through cracks despite his patchwork repairs. The cottage groaned under the weight of the wind, shutters rattling, floorboards vibrating with each crash of waves below. John lit the lanterns, their small flames flickering wildly, and sat at the table with Arthur's journal spread before him. He told himself he needed to focus, to use the noise outside as a cloak for concentration, but in truth he was driven by the feeling that if he did not unravel Arthur's words now, he might never have another chance. Page after page he studied the cramped handwriting, his finger tracing the diagrams, the strange spirals that had haunted his nights since he first uncovered them. Outside, the wind screamed, lifting shingles from the roof like brittle leaves, but he hardly flinched. The words pulled him deeper. Arthur had written of storms like this, of nights when the tower itself shuddered, and he feared it would topple into the sea. But interwoven with the descriptions of weather were darker entries. Men at his door, demanding maps, demanding truth. He had refused them, night after night, until the storm came that ended his life. John paused, his hand tightening on the page. The final entries were shaky, the ink blurred as though written in haste. If I fall, let the sea guard what I could not. Let the light remain. The lantern beside him flickered and nearly died as the wind forced its way through the cracks in the cottage. Ranger barked sharply, leaping to his feet, claws scrambling on the boards as he dashed to the window. John followed, pushing the curtain aside just as lightning split the sky. For an instant, the entire cove lit in brilliant white, and he saw them, footprints in the mud just beyond the fence, wide and heavy, pointing toward the cottage. He felt his pulse slam through his veins. Someone had been there during the storm. He yanked the curtain shut, bolted the door, and pulled Ranger close. The hours stretched endless as the storm raged on. John sat with his rifle across his knees, the journal closed but still within reach, listening to the storm hammer the world around him. Ranger never left the door, his ears pricked, muscles taut. Every crash of thunder rattled the glass. Every surge of waves sent vibrations through the floor. Yet through it all, John felt something shift within him. He had come here seeking escape, seeking silence. But in this chaos, in the fury of the storm and the possibility of men outside waiting for him to falter, he felt a familiar steadiness return. This was not the silence that drowned him. This was noise, raw and real, something to stand against. Near midnight, the wind reached its peak. The cottage shuddered violently, one shutter tearing free and slamming against the wall with a metallic scream. John surged forward, pinning it closed with his shoulder while Ranger barked furiously beside him. He lashed it with rope, muscles straining, rain soaking through his shirt until he was chilled to the bone. When it finally held, he staggered back inside, dripping, breath coming in ragged bursts. He wiped his face and looked at Ranger, who stared back with fierce loyalty. They had weathered worse nights together, but this one carried the weight of more than survival. It felt like a test. When dawn at last broke, the sky was a pale wash of gray, the sea calmer though still restless, its surface littered with white foam. The land bore the storm's scars, trees uprooted, rocks slick with debris, the cottage battered but still standing. John stepped outside with Ranger at his heel, his boots sinking into the sodden earth. He surveyed the damage, noting the broken shutters, the roof peeled in places, the fence nearly flattened. Yet it was not defeat that filled him, but pride. The lighthouse had stood, the cottage had endured, and so had he. He walked slowly to the edge of the cliff, the compass heavy in his pocket. Pulling it free, he held it level against the weak morning light. As always, the needle did not point north. It swung once, lazily, then locked onto the sea, steady and unwavering. He followed its direction with his eyes, scanning the restless horizon. Somewhere out there lay the wreck Arthur had guarded, the truth others still sought to claim. He clenched the compass in his fist, his jaw tightening. He understood now what the storm had given him. Not peace, not safety, but clarity. Ranger pressed against his leg, and John lowered his hand to the dog's head. The animal leaned into his touch, silent as always, but his presence was answer enough. They were no longer running. They were standing. This lighthouse, this cliff, this legacy, it was theirs to protect. The storm had not broken them. It had forged them. That night, with the cottage patched and the lantern burning steady once more, John sat in the lantern room, gazing out at the ocean. The glass of the great lens was still coated in salt and time, but as the setting sun struck it, a faint glimmer of light refracted, scattering across the walls in fractured beams. For a moment it looked as though the lighthouse itself had awoken, stretching after a long sleep. John's chest ached at the sight. He realized then that he had not come here to vanish. He had come here to keep the light, even if he hadn't known it, and he would keep it, whatever storm or enemy rose against him. The ordeal had not ended. The footprints outside told him that. The glimmer on the ridge, the whispers in town, all of it pointed toward a greater storm still waiting. But he no longer felt like a man cornered. He felt like a man chosen. The sea had tested him, and he had endured. Now, whatever came next, he was ready. The morning after the storm carried with it a silence so complete that it seemed unnatural. John stood at the edge of the cliffs with Ranger pressed close to his leg, gazing out at the ocean that still heaved with restless swells. Foam clung to the rocks below like the remnants of a battle, and uprooted branches littered the slope that led down to the water. The air was sharp with salt and the damp smell of earth torn open by the gale. Yet above it all, the sky stretched clear and pale, streaked with the faintest wash of blue. For the first time since arriving, he felt as though he could breathe without something clawing at his chest. He had faced the worst the sea could throw at him, and though battered and scarred, both he and the lighthouse still stood. The storm had changed more than the landscape. It had changed him. The night before, with thunder tearing the world apart and footprints in the mud outside his door, he had realized that he was no longer merely a man running from ghosts. He was the keeper of something worth protecting, a sentinel not only for the light within the tower, but for the fragments of his own soul that had begun to return in the struggle. He carried the compass in his pocket, its steady weight pressing against him like a reminder, and the journal lay open on the table where he had left it, its cryptic maps no longer incomprehensible. The lines made sense now. He could see what Arthur had meant, could trace the currents, the reefs, the place where the Caledonia had fallen beneath the waves. He knew what had been hidden and why others had sought it. But he also knew this truth was no longer about treasure or secrets. It was about light. Arthur had given his life to keep it burning, and now John found himself bound by the same duty. The storm had tested him, and in surviving it, he had chosen his path. He would not abandon the lighthouse, not to weather, not to time, and not to the men who watched from the ridge. He would stand, and he would fight if he must. The days that followed were filled with work. The cottage bore deep wounds from the storm shutters splintered, parts of the roof peeled away, boards warped by water. John repaired them all with the relentless focus of a soldier rebuilding a fortress. Each nail hammered into wood was more than carpentry. It was defiance, a declaration that this place was his and would endure. He patched the fence, reinforced the door, and scavenged what materials he could from the wreckage strewn along the cliffs. Ranger followed him tirelessly, pausing often to scan the horizon, tail stiff, ears pricked. The dog's vigilance had become a constant rhythm in John's days, as steady as the tides themselves. And then there was the tower. Each evening, after the work below was done, John climbed the spiral staircase with tools in hand. He scrubbed the glass panes of the lantern room, scraping away layers of salt and grime until the world beyond shone clear. He tightened bolts that had loosened with decades of neglect, replaced rusted fittings, and rewired what little of the lantern's circuit he could salvage. The great lens, once dulled and forgotten, began to gleam faintly under his touch, reflecting shards of sunlight that danced across the walls and fractured beams. Standing there in the evenings with Ranger lying watchful at the narrow window, John felt as though he were coaxing the tower back to life, one breath, one movement at a time. The town remained distant. When he ventured in for supplies, the stairs followed him still, though now there was something else behind them, something quieter, almost uncertain. Whispers still chased him through the general store, but he noticed the muttering softened when he paid in cash without complaint, when he carried his purchases with quiet steadiness back to the truck. The gray-haired woman at the diner still eyed him sharply, but her words were no longer only warning. One evening as she poured his coffee, she murmured, "You didn't run when the storm came. That says something." He met her gaze without answering, but when she walked away, a strange warmth stirred in his chest. Perhaps the town was not as hostile as it had seemed. Perhaps they too were waiting to see if he would endure where others had failed. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, John climbed to the lantern room and sat with the journal in his lap. He traced the final entries, the words Arthur had written in his last days, and felt the echo of the man's resolve. "If I fall, let the sea guard what I could not. Let the light remain." John closed the book, his hand trembling slightly as he set it aside. He rose and moved to the lens, resting both hands against its cold glass. The sun struck it directly then, a sudden blaze of gold piercing the room, and the glass caught it, fractured it, multiplied it. For the first time in decades, the lighthouse glowed. It was not the electric light of a lantern, not the steady beam of machinery, but a natural brilliance refracted through time and care. The light burst outward, stretching across the sea like a signal flare, and John stood frozen, his breath caught, as though the tower itself had chosen this moment to awaken. Down below, Ranger barked once, sharp and loud, tail wagging as if he too recognized the miracle. John pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his eyes stinging with more than the reflection. He had not wept in years, not through loss or battle or silence, but now with light spilling across the ocean and his dog's steady presence at his side, he felt the sting of tears he could not hold back. The tower was alive again, and so was he. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. By morning, a handful of townsfolk had gathered on the road overlooking the cliffs, pointing toward the glimmering glass. By the next day, there were more. Some shook their heads, muttering about curses, but others simply stared in silence, their faces lit with something close to awe. Reporters came eventually, drawn by whispers of a veteran who had bought a forgotten lighthouse for $1 and somehow brought it back to life. John refused most interviews, turning them away at the gate, but he could not stop the photographs taken from the ridge. His face appeared in local papers, standing beside the tower with Ranger at his heel, and soon the story spread further, beyond Windmere Cove, beyond Oregon, to places John had never expected to be remembered. He did not care for the attention, the grants offered, the book deals proposed, the curious strangers who came asking to tour the grounds. All of it felt distant, unimportant. What mattered was the silence within the cottage, no longer suffocating but full, steady, like the hush of a church. What mattered was the rhythm of his days, the repairs, the maintenance, the climbs to the lantern room where the sun sometimes struck the lens just right and sent light streaming across the water. What mattered was Ranger lying content at his side each night, the dog's presence a reminder that he was never alone. In time, the locals softened. Children waved when he drove into town. A fisherman nodded at him without malice as they passed on the street. And one evening, as John sat on the stone steps outside the cottage watching the tide roll in, the gray-haired woman from the diner walked up the path carrying a mug of tea. She handed it to him without a word, then sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. After a long silence, she said, "You did good, better than any of us expected." John sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through him, and allowed himself a faint smile. "I didn't do it alone," he said, glancing down at Ranger curled on the step below. The woman nodded. "No, but you stayed when everyone else left. That makes all the difference." The waves rolled steady below them, the sun slipping into the sea in a blaze of fire and gold. John leaned back against the stone, his shoulders easing for the first time in years. He thought of the man he had been when he arrived here, a hollowed soldier seeking only silence, weighed down by ghosts and losses he could not name. And he thought of the man he had become, the one who had stood through storms, who had unearthed secrets, who had brought light back to a place the world had abandoned. He had not started over. He had not erased his past. But in these stones, in this tower, he had found a way to carry it and to keep moving forward. As darkness settled and the first stars pricked the sky, John rose and walked back into the tower. He climbed the spiral staircase with Ranger at his side, each step echoing with purpose. At the top, he stood before the great lens once more, the compass in his pocket, the journal resting safe in its drawer. He placed his hand against the glass, and for a moment, as the last rays of twilight struck, the lens glowed faintly, sending a whisper of light across the sea. He smiled then, not because the world was watching, not because history had been rewritten, but because for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt whole. And so the man who had once traded his last dollar for a forgotten ruin stood now as its keeper, not just of stone and glass, but of light itself. The sea roared below, endless and eternal, But within the tower, the silence was no longer empty. It was steady, alive, a silence earned. John closed his eyes, resting one hand on Ranger's head, and whispered into the quiet, "We're home." The light, fractured but unbroken, stretched out across the waves like a promise, and the lighthouse, long abandoned, kept its watch once more. Before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. And if you think this lighthouse journey was powerful, just wait until you see what's coming next. Click on one of these videos right here and keep watching. Each one is more unbelievable than the last. And one more thing, share this video with a friend. You never know who might need a reminder that even in the darkest storms, the light is never truly gone.